Good morning. Welcome to First Parish Unitarian Universalist of Medfield, and welcome to all of you who are streaming in from home as well. We hope you'll all stay with us following the service for social hour downstairs. This congregation first gathered in 1651, and this historic meeting house was built in 1789, which was and is still now the unceded ancestral lands of the Nipmuc Nation, who inhabited this area for thousands of years prior to the arrival of the European colonists. Welcome. Welcome to this place. Here we search for truth and understanding. Here we celebrate life and we contemplate its mysteries. Here we share healing and wholeness. So whoever you are, wherever you come from, whomever you love, we welcome you to this congregation.
We light this chalice today as a people dedicated to personal growth. May it burn away the oppressions we have been taught and glow instead with the humility of learning. May it reignite our dreams for a better world and kindle our joy for simple living. May its warmth extend out into the forgotten alleyways of exclusion and bring us home to love, to welcoming, and to all the challenges, the questions, and the blessings of this beautiful path to becoming a beloved community.
It is said that ministers are here to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. I would say that we are all afflicted and we are all comfortable. May our time together this morning be a comfort and a confrontation. May we find peace in times of tumult. May we invite tumult into peace in our lives. May we find calm in times of restlessness. May we allow restlessness to evolve into action. May this hour bring dreams of new ways of being together in this world. Come, let us worship together. Please rise in body or in spirit for our opening hymn, The Lone Wild Bird. It's number 15 in your gray hymnal. You may be seated. Let's quiet our hearts as we enter into a time of prayer and meditation. Oh, Spirit of life, Spirit of love, come together yet again, the end of another week. Some worn down by the struggles of health, some weary of all that's happening in our world. We are a community that makes space for the sharing of all the joys and sorrows, the angers and hopes, keeping our hearts open with grace and compassion. In our nation's life, we pause this holiday weekend to remember the Native American lives lost from the European colonization on this land. Teach us to remember our history. That we cannot make amends for what has come before. May we learn from those ways, never to repeat them in our lives today. May we develop new ways of relating to neighbor and stranger without violence or coercion, without deceit or greed. Help us to find a sense of humility where we have privilege, and strength where we have oppression. As a community of faith, may we be a safe harbor in a world that is often harsh toward difference. Challenge us to use our presence as a healing force for justice and equity. Let's hold all of this in our hearts as we enter into a time of silent meditation. Amen. Now I'd invite forward Margaret Rolfe to share with us the morning's reading.
Today's reading is A False Story of Discovery by Reverend Mike Johnson. Every October and November in the United States, we find ourselves in a season of false and misleading stories about European settlers and Native Americans. First, there's the story that Columbus discovered America in 1492. Then there's the story about the Pilgrims at the first Thanksgiving. It is astonishing, after all the work done by Native activists and their allies, that these stories keep returning unchanged year after year. Perhaps many people are willing to acknowledge, if pressed, that when Columbus supposedly discovered America, it was already full of people. But that discovery has a more sinister history that's not often talked about. Prior to 1492, European church leaders and monarchs had collaborated in a stunning series of proclamations, which became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. In 1452, the Pope declared that the King of Portugal had the right to conquer any Muslim and pagan peoples and enslave them. A few years later, a second letter declared that all Christian kings of Europe had the right to take the lands and possessions of any non-Christian people and keep them in perpetuity. If the pagan inhabitants could be converted to the Christian faith, they might be spared, but otherwise they could be enslaved or killed. The doctrine of discovery was also later claimed by England in 1496, authorizing English explorers to seize any lands not already discovered by other Christian nations. The doctrine of discovery became the legal basis for the discoveries of Columbus and others, and for the resulting attempts to conquer and colonize the Western Hemisphere, unleashing genocide on its peoples. It was also the legal basis for the slave trade. Its influence did not remain in that distant past. It's still a source of oppression to this day. It became the basis of U.S. Indian law beginning in 1823, when Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Christian people who had discovered the lands of heathens had assumed the right of dominion and thus had diminished the Indians' rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations. He claimed Indians had merely a right of occupancy in their lands. This decision has never been overturned and is still cited on a regular basis in federal court. Responding to the requests of indigenous people, several religious denominations have passed resolutions to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, including Unitarian Universalists in 2012. These resolutions are a first step toward reckoning with this history of stolen lands and stolen children.
Thank you, Margaret. Well, as we all know, tomorrow is our national observance of Columbus Day. And like most Americans, you probably learned a whole lot about Christopher Columbus when you were a child. And much of it is filled with distortions, omissions, and downright lies. It feels to me like when I was a child, in every single U.S. history class I ever took, all the way from elementary school to college, we always started with Columbus. So here's a sample of the lies that your teacher told you, and they told me. It's mentioned in the book Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. Number 1, Christopher Columbus discovered America. Well, even if you were to discount all the indigenous people that were already here, there were Vikings from Europe and explorers from Siberia who came here much, much earlier. Number 2, the ships endured bad weather. No, that's not true. Columbus's own journals say the seas were calm. We just like that adventure tale, so we keep telling it. Number 3, everyone thought the earth was flat, and Columbus proved otherwise. Nope. It was common knowledge at the time that the earth was round, modern day flat earthers notwithstanding. Number 4, Columbus just wanted to explore and find a trade route to the West Indies. Actually, he was pretty into conquest and exploitation as well. Number 5, Columbus made friends with the native population and gave them their name Indians. Well, the last part is true, but definitely not the first. Number 6, Columbus was Italian. Well, this isn't certain either. He may have been Spanish. He may even have been Jewish. We don't know. In reality, when Columbus and his crew first landed in Hispaniola, their first order of business upon meeting the Arawak Indians was to discover if they had any gold. The Arawak told them that there was this tribe nearby that had gold, so he sailed to the other side of the island. And thanks to Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest and contemporary of Columbus who transcribed the explorer's journal, we know of Columbus's motivation at the time. As Columbus wrote, the Indians, well, they have these large communal bell-shaped buildings, housing up to 600 people at one time. They lack all manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and rely exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They are extremely generous with their possessions. With 50 men, Columbus wrote, we could easily subjugate them and make them do whatever we want. Well, after reporting his findings to the monarchy of Spain, Columbus returned to Hispaniola in 1493 with 17 ships and more than 1,000 men. He planted a settlement of European soldiers on the islands who brutalized the indigenous Arawak nation and then returned to Spain with 400 Arawak slaves. The Arawaks, as you might not be surprised to hear, resisted. This gave Columbus an excuse to slaughter and conquer them, besides the ready-made excuse of their not being Christian. Well, over the next 10 years, Columbus made voyages to what is now called Venezuela and the eastern coast of Central America, each time planting colonies of men who invaded the local indigenous populations, raiding their homes, killed anyone who got in their way, stole their golds, and then brought more indigenous slaves back to Spain. This is the man who we celebrate on Columbus Day. So today I'd invite us to consider what it might mean to be agents of healing of one of the oldest and deepest wounds of this nation. One that centuries after first inflicted continues to be aggravated even today. A wound summed up by the word discovery. It's such an exciting word, discovery. It's what inspires so many of us to do our work, to discover new things, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Who would ever thought that it could become a shield for oppression, for murder, enslavement, and even genocide? And yet it did. I remember in school being taught that this era was known as the Age of Discovery, a time roughly from the 15th to the 18th centuries when courageous Europeans set sail to establish routes to trade with other people in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Those sailors were interested in far more than just trading. Where they found valuable resources, precious metals, gems, and so on, they also sought to seize foreign lands and slaves for their own. In this enterprise, they received the blessing of the church. In 1454, Pope Nicholas V issued a proclamation, or a papal bull, that authorized the King of Portugal, whose soldiers were colonizing West Africa, to, quote, invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all pagans and other enemies of Christ, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away their possessions and property. After Columbus's trip to Hispaniola in 1492, the Spanish court sought and received a similar papal bull that extended them the same privileges. Other European courts adopted this doctrine of discovery to support their own colonizing. And those plucky pilgrims who came a bit later, they were our religious forebears. They paid little mind to all of the indigenous peoples who occupied the land that they traveled to. To their eyes, they were looking upon pristine, virginal wilderness. But as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz points out in an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, that untamed wilderness was actually occupied by some 15 million people, the majority of whom were farmers who lived in established towns. Also, by their actions, it's plain that it wasn't freedom that the settlers sought to spread across the country, but dominion. And later, Thomas Jefferson, he who proclaimed that it was self-evident that all are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was quick as Secretary of State to claim the European doctrine of discovery as a way of denying Indian claims to their own lands and opening up to settlers. Later, Chief Justice John Marshall declared in a Supreme Court decision that due to the European doctrine of discovery, Indians had, quote, lost their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations and would only be recognized as occupying their lands. Subsequent decisions designated Indian peoples as domestic dependent nations, forever subject to control of the federal government. These precedents not only remain in the law, but in the years since have been used repeatedly to appropriate Indian lands previously given by treaty and to remove Indians from their ancient homelands. They also were the basis of campaigns of violence against them, including moments that were nothing short of slaughter. In America, it's part of a legacy that has crippled and marginalized Native peoples for generations. And so we are left to wonder how to deal with all of this now. Well, as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz points out, this notion that we as a nation, or even we as individuals, are privileged to do what we want, to grab what we like, and throw our weight around, regardless of the consequences or the impact on the peoples, is collateral damage from the wound that doctrine of discovery inflicted. Back in 1992, at the 500th anniversary of Columbus arriving in the Americas, indigenous peoples argued that to recognize this history, the day now designated as Columbus Day, which comes tomorrow on our calendar, should instead be designated as Indigenous Peoples Day. Since then, there has been a growing movement seeking to bring attention to the experience of Indigenous peoples. Now we have more than 100 cities and a dozen states that have formally recognized tomorrow as Indigenous Peoples Day. But sadly, here in Massachusetts, we are not one of them yet, though there is a bill before the legislature to do so. Back in 2014, Lakota activist Bill Means had this to say about why the celebration should be changed from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. As he says, "We discovered Columbus, lost on our shores, sick, destitute, and wrapped in rags. We nourished him to health, and the rest is history. He represents the mascot of American colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. And so it is time that we change this myth of history." It's not a bad idea. It's time that we discard this myth of discovery, that we acknowledge the damage that our forebears inflicted on Native peoples by the ravages of colonialism. And maybe it's time that we open a conversation about who Indigenous people really are. Not exotic figures out of a mythic past, but people with a unique story and a unique place in this country. As Margaret mentioned, in 2012 at our GA, the Unitarian Universalist Association adopted a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery, a move that put us in company with the Episcopal Church and the World Council of Churches. We also resolved to expose the historical reality and impact of the doctrine and eliminate it. Even in our policies and our practices, wherever we might find it. What might that look like is an interesting challenge for each of us to consider. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks of how frustrated Native peoples are in that in recent years, even as their history has been acknowledged, they find themselves lumped in as just one of many racial minorities who have suffered historic discrimination. All that, she says, ignores the many very real ways that they continue to be marginalized today. She quotes Ojibwe historian Gene O'Brien, who talks of how Indians are written out of existence by what she calls firsting and lasting. Towns, she says, create monuments to what they call the first settlements, the first dwelling, or even first parish, as if there had never been occupants in those places before the European colonists arrived. Meanwhile, she says, a national narrative tells us of last Indians or last tribes, the last of the Mohicans, or the famous sculpture by James Earl Fraser of a mounted Indian slumped over his horse entitled "End of the Trail." Been so many ways that the U.S. government engaged in the systematic extermination of indigenous people. Another insidious way is outlawing any practice or language of indigenous people. Anything that was a reflection or manifestation of their culture, religion, lifestyle, language, or heritage was strictly forbidden. Punishment was swift and terrible. Recently, we changed that and began the long, hard work of restoration and reconciliation. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, a U.S. federal law, was passed in 1978. It was created to protect and preserve the traditional religious rites and cultural practices of American Indians, of Eskimos, and Native Hawaiians. Native people now are continuing to restore or recover their languages, their culture, and customs, as well as their religious practices and beliefs. We who are not Native cannot begin to understand the pain and suffering endured by Native people during the centuries when they were prohibited from living as their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. If we are ever to live in harmony and balance with the earth and all of our relations, we must acknowledge our history, all of it, make amends where we can, begin again in greater understanding when we can, and give proper place and agency to all of our relations. It matters. It matters that we see Indigenous people. It matters that we call them by their own names. It matters that we validate their experience of colonization and that we work to make amends. We personally might not be responsible for this colonization, but we are beneficiaries of that process. We are responsible for what we do now that we begin to comprehend and understand the devastating long-term consequences of that process. It matters that we honor Indigenous people and their place in both the history and the future of this land. We are called to act with love and justice. We are called to live in contrast to the violence of our own ancestors. So may it be. Amen. Now I'd invite forward Fritz Fleischman to introduce our offering.
Good morning again. Yesterday, the Boston Globe had an article about the recent hurricanes hitting Florida, and the headline of the article was, "Will New England experience a similar hurricane? The question is not if, but when." In 2013, as Hurricane Sandy was bearing down upon us, I had one of my key moments in my relationship with this congregation when a member of this congregation called our house and said, "Would you and Katrin like to come over to our house since you're so concerned about the tall trees surrounding yours?" So, I think we should make every effort to strengthen this congregation as we face this very uncertain future, because where would we turn? Where would I turn? If a hurricane hit New England, I would turn to this congregation. So, let us once again strengthen our congregation and donate generously. Thank you.
Please rise in body or in spirit for our closing hymn, number 184, Be Ye Lamps Unto Yourself. As we prepare to leave this sacred space, may we see all as it is, and may it all be as we see it. May we be the ones to make it as it should be. For if not us, who? If not now, when? This is answering the cry of justice with the work of peace. This is redeeming the pain of history with the grace of wisdom. This is the work that we are called to do, and this is the call we answer now. To be the living embodiment of our values, to be a people of intention and a people of conscience, to be about the work of building a beloved community. Go in peace. I will now extinguish our chalice, but may its light and warmth stay in our hearts until we meet again. Here ends our worship. Let our service begin.